Alright guys, Dominic here for Kit Guru, and today we are back with another QD-OLED monitor review. You may remember back in April I checked out the 4K 240Hz MSI MPG 321 URX. Well, today we're checking out another screen also using a 3rd gen QD-OLED panel from Samsung, but this time it's the 1440p 360Hz MSI MPG 271 QRX. That refresh rate means not only is this the fastest OLED monitor I have ever used, but it also comes with a whole host of other OLED benefits, such as near instant response times, HDR brightness up to 1000 nits, and of course effectively infinite contrast ratio. Today then, let's find out just how good this monitor is. The first thing I want to say then is if you haven't already seen my review of the MSI MPG 321 URX, which is that 4K 240Hz model I reviewed back in April, I do recommend giving that a watch, as there are, as you might expect, quite a number of similarities between that screen and the 271 QRX we are looking at today, so it does kind of help set the scene. That really starts with the design, for instance, as the 271 QRX is effectively a scaled down version of the 32-inch model. Honestly, apart from the size, there's really very little to tell them apart. That means the display is almost entirely matte black with a bezel-less design on the front, while that little grey chin there you can see measures approximately 14mm thick. The rear is home to the MSI Dragon logo, and there is a small RGB zone above the stand, though it is very tiny and obviously not visible from the front. I do appreciate though that MSI has kept the square-ish stand foot too, instead of the large V-shaped feet we typically see. That said, as with the 321 URX, I do feel the stand and the rear of the monitor are a little bit plasticky considering the price point, but once it's set up on your desk, it's not a particular concern. Speaking of that stand though, we do get a full array of ergonomic adjustments. That includes up to 110mm of height adjust, you get 30 degrees of swivel both left and right, and then there's tilt from 5 degrees downwards to 20 degrees upwards, along with 90-degree pivot both left and right, so you can use this screen vertically if you wish. On top of that, if you already have an existing wall mount or monitor desk clamp, you can use VESA 100x100 mount with this screen. As for the port selection on offer, MSI has opted for one DisplayPort 1.4a and then two HDMI 2.1, and all three of those can drive 1440p at 360Hz, while there's also a USB-C that supports DP-Alt mode alongside 90 watts power delivery. Then we find a USB Type-B upstream which feeds the two USB Type-A downstream ports, and KVM functionality is also supported. Positioned centrally on the rear of the screen, we also find a small joystick used to navigate the OSD, and this is flanked by two buttons. One is just the power button, and the other is a customizable option which can be configured using MSI's gaming intelligence software that we will look at shortly. Speaking of the OSD then, the 271 QRX is, as you'd expect, using the same OSD system that we have seen time and time again from MSI, so I really don't have any major complaints. It's quick to navigate using the joystick, I think things are sensibly laid out, and it is very well featured. You've got all the gamer specific options we have come to expect, as well as customizable white balance and SRGB emulation mode and so on. As mentioned as well, there is also the option to install MSI's Gaming Intelligence app, which can be used to control the monitor direct from your Windows desktop. Just as I found on the 321 URX, it baffles me that you can't actually adjust the app's window size, but it still has all the same options as the OSD for adjusting things, and probably most importantly, it can be used to update the monitor's firmware.
If you're looking for a new chair, then you should definitely check out Boolies. I'm currently sat on their Ninja Pro gaming chair, which is one of 3 models from their gaming series alongside the Elite and the Master. So if you're looking for something new to stick in your setup that you can sit on and game and work, then I recommend definitely checking out boolies.co.uk.
That is really going to do it for our look at the design of the monitor though, but let's talk about the panel itself, and this brings us on to our testing, where we are using Portrait Display's Calman Ultimate software and an X-Rite i1 Display Pro Plus colorimeter. Kicking things off then with brightness and contrast, it is worth clarifying that we did select the user mode for this test. Out of the box, the 271 QRX actually defaults to the Eco mode, and that just caps brightness slightly lower than what can be achieved with the user mode. Still, the results are pretty much as we'd expect. We see a peak brightness of just over 250 nits, while the minimum of 30 nits is very impressive. It's also worth pointing out that luminance is very steady regardless of the window size, or APL. Some OLED, usually WOLED monitors, will show a noticeable drop-off in brightness as the window size gets bigger, even in SDR mode, but that is not the case for the 271 QRX. Moving on though, we see extremely wide gamut coverage thanks to that QD-OLED panel. It well exceeds the SRGB color space and delivers 99.2% coverage of DCI-P3 alongside 96.8% reporting of the Adobe RGB color space, and Rec 2020 coverage is also decent, hitting 80.4%. Moving on to grayscale testing, out of the box the 271 QRX delivers solid results with an average Delta E 2000 of 2.64. As you can see, my sample does have a slightly warm correlated color temperature, or CCT, of 6042K, something we also observed from the 321 URX. Gamma tracking is generally fine though, averaging 2.18, though it is just slightly too low in the brighter shades. Thankfully though, there is user adjustable white balance available in the OSD, and I got significantly improved results simply by lowering the red balance from 100 down to 96 and putting the green channel at 98. That resulted in an average Delta E 2000 of just 1.14, which is really good, and an improved average CCT of 6464K. In terms of saturation then, given just how wide this monitor's gamut is, it's really no surprise that we see quite a bit of oversaturation relative to the sRGB space. Things do look better relative to the DCI-P3 color space however, with an average Delta E 2000 of 2.14. Of course, that has a knock-on effect for color accuracy, as relative to sRGB, it is fairly poor from this monitor with an average Delta E 2000 of 4.88. Once again though, if we compare to the DCI-P3 space instead, the results do improve with a new Delta E 2000 of 2.57. If you are reading that and feeling slightly alarmed as you work in the sRGB color space, don't worry, as MSI does include an sRGB emulation mode, and this honestly does a good job at clamping the gamut, as we can see here. Now, this mode didn't correct the slightly warm color balance we saw using the out-of-the-box settings, and color balance settings are actually locked down when the sRGB mode is applied, but it has actually improved gamma tracking to almost flawless levels, and the overall grayscale Delta E of just 2.01 is still very decent. As for saturation accuracy, this is very much improved, and you can see the average Delta E 2000 of just 1.32, and that's compared against 4.15 using the out-of-the-box settings. Likewise, color accuracy has come on tremendously with a new average Delta E 2000 of 1.22, and that makes this one of the best sRGB emulation modes I have ever used. Of course, I did also put the 271 QRX through a full calibration using Kalman Ultimate software. This delivered almost flawless grayscale and gamma tracking, while our average Delta E for our saturation sweeps dropped to just 0.59, and we actually saw the exact same Delta E from our color accuracy testing. Just before moving on as well, it is worth quickly confirming that, as we'd expect from an OLED monitor, viewing angles are absolutely stellar with basically no visible color shift. Just before we move on to response time then and talking about real world usage, there are a few other quirks of QD-OLED monitors that I do want to quickly touch on. I'm not going to go into heaps of detail, as really it's all the same stuff that I already covered in the 321 URX review, so again, if you want to check that out, I'll leave a link in the description below. The first thing then is that we do find the same semi-gloss coating, and that can result in raised black levels depending on your environment, though if, like me, you prefer to game in a dimmer room, I really don't find this a problem. Also, the subpixel structure, although improved from the first gen models, may be a problem for some due to text fringing, but again, I have to say, especially on this third gen panel, it really doesn't bother me at all. And then of course there is always the risk of permanent burn-in with any OLED monitor, but MSI does include a whole suite of anti-burn-in protections within the OSD, and these are all aimed at reducing brightness of static elements, plus you do get MSI's 3-year warranty that does include burn-in protection. Time to move on though and talk about response times, where we're using the open source response time tool. As I've started doing in most of my OLED monitors now, however, we're not going to spend too much time on this section, as all the results are much of a muchness and they're pretty much exactly as we'd expect, as we see very fast response times across the board regardless of the refresh rate used. We know, however, that doesn't mean motion clarity will be flawless regardless of the refresh rate, as with OLED, the higher you can pump that refresh rate, the smoother things will look. With that in mind, coming into this review, I was actually most interested to see if there was any real visible difference between a QD-OLED at 240Hz and one at 360Hz. Now, as you can see here, there's no doubt the difference is small, but I do still think it's perceptible, as you can tell from these pursuit images using the Blurbusters UFO test. One thing I also really wanted to check out is just how a 360Hz OLED monitor compares to a 360Hz IPS LCD. Compared here then against the 271 QRX, we have MSI's Oculux NXG253R using its fast overdrive mode. Now, this is the only 360Hz LCD screen I have to hand, and it is a couple of years old at this point, but it really does serve as an illustration that OLEDs are incredibly impressive when it comes to motion clarity at high refresh rates, and why I personally think they are the absolute king of gaming monitors. Just speaking a bit then to my real world usage of playing games on this screen on a day-to-day basis, I think it probably should go without saying that driving 1440p resolution up to 360 FPS isn't easy for AAA games, so I do think this screen is probably more aimed at those who primarily play FPS or other competitive titles where it is much easier to reach those lofty frame rates. I may be very rusty, but I have to say I had a great time playing Call of Duty with frame rates over 240 FPS to try and get as much out of this panel as possible. With that said though, even if you can't drive this monitor to its maximum refresh rate, it is still a QD-OLED screen with incredibly punchy colours and great response time, so I tried a bunch of other games like Star Wars Jedi Survivor, running around at 120 FPS, and I found that to still look absolutely fantastic. So it's really not like you can't use it for AAA action or RPG titles, you just might not get the full benefit of the higher refresh rate and the improved motion clarity. I'm also happy to say that although the screen isn't yet officially G-Sync certified, Adaptive Sync did work without a hitch on my RTX 4090. We can't go on any further, however, without talking about HDR, which is of course a huge part of any OLED monitor. Just like the MSI 321 URX, the 271 QRX does default to the HDR True Black 400 mode when HDR is enabled. As we can see here, this does limit brightness in HDR to about 460 nits, and that's sustained up to a 10% APL, and after that brightness slowly declines until it hits a full screen figure of 273 nits. There is, however, a peak 1000 nits mode, which is my personal preference. As for what it does, it is pretty self-explanatory. It delivers a peak of just over 1000 nits for the 1% and 2% APLs before dropping off as the window size increases. Other than brightness though, the difference between the two modes is quite hard to spot. RGB balance is very similar, as is the overall grayscale delta E. There is just a tiny difference when looking at the EOTF tracking, as the HDR Peak 1000 mode does roll off just slightly early compared to the True Black 400 mode, and that is something we also observed from the 321 URX, but both are generally pretty accurate and really don't pose any headaches for use with HDR content. Colour accuracy with HDR enabled is also very similar between the two modes. Each deliver average delta E's of around 2.4 to 2.6. As we'd expect, the least accurate results are for the 100% cyan and 100% green channels, which the monitor simply can't display accurately due to its sub 100% coverage of the Rec 2020 colour space. In short, we are simply getting another very impressive HDR experience from the 271 QRX, and that's honestly nothing less than what we've come to expect, considering this is a QD-OLED monitor. If you do get a chance to try one, I really do recommend it, as the difference between proper HDR, like what you get here, cannot be understated, especially if you're only used to something like IPS screens, which are only certified for display HDR 400, which, as I've said many times, in my opinion, it's just not HDR at all. Wrapping up this review then, there really haven't been any surprises from the 271 QRX, in the sense that it's done everything I expected it to, and it is a very good gaming monitor. If you did see my review of the MSI MPG 321 URX, the core foundation is the same, but the 271 QRX drops the resolution to 1440p and increases the refresh rate up to 360 Hz. I honestly wasn't sure what difference 360Hz would make versus a 240Hz OLED monitor, and while the difference is relatively small, I do think it is perceptible and offers what I'd say is the best motion clarity of any monitor I have ever tested. As I mentioned earlier in the video, it's really not easy to drive AAA games at frame rates approaching 360 FPS, so I do think this kind of screen is probably going to make most sense for someone who plays competitive titles. But that said, it does still work very well for something like single-player RPGs or action games as well. As for my criticisms of this monitor, I am going to echo the point I made in my review of the 321 URX, just about the stand and the build quality, as I do think it feels just a little bit too plasticky considering this price point, and I really think more metal in the design would help alleviate that and give it much more of a premium feeling, which I think a screen of this quality does deserve. Speaking of the pricing, however, that does actually bring me on to, by far and away, my biggest issue with this screen. Once again, UK buyers are just getting the short end of the stick, as the 271 QRX is actually on sale for £999 over here, but in the US, it's up for $799, which frankly irritates me, and I really don't see why this has to be the case. Making matters worse for MSI is the fact that both the Alienware and Gigabyte models, which use the same QD-OLED panel, are actually on sale in the UK for about a couple £100 less. In the case of the Alienware, it's actually just over £700, so that is a fair chunk of change cheaper than MSI's own model here. And that for me does just put a bit of a downer at the end of this review, as I can't really wrap my head around paying over £250 more than some other competition when they're using the same QD-OLED panel from Samsung. As you hopefully would have been able to tell from all of the testing in this video, I do think this is a very, very good gaming monitor, especially if you know you're going to be able to drive high frame rates. I just think MSI needs to get a bit more real and drop the price so it's in line with the competition, as right now I think £999 is just too much. Anyway guys, that is going to do it for this review. If you liked it, please do toss me a thumbs up, and as always, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. If you haven't already, please do subscribe and ding that notification bell so you don't miss when we upload a new video. And if you want to carry on the conversation with us over in our Discord server, you can do that with a link in the description below. While you're there, you can also find a link to check out our merch store where you can pick up cool t-shirts like the ones on screen. And lastly, if you're feeling particularly generous, you can consider backing us on Patreon. That's it for this one though guys, I'm Dominic for Kit Guru, and I'll see you in the next video.